Okay, so it's Mother's Day, in case you didn't realize that. And when I think about Mother's Day, I think about my mama, because my mama was a stereotypical Southern lady, and she had incredible class. And while I realize some mothers are very outspoken, my mama was not outspoken. I mean, literally, you had to be caught on fire before she would speak up and say someone needs to be doing something about it. Now, she might quietly pull you aside after the whole thing was over, or if an event was happening or you were doing something wrong, she'd say, no, you might want to just think about it, because she wouldn't want to embarrass you in front of anybody. So then let's fast forward. As we're growing up, we went out to eat about once a week, and every time we go into the restaurant, and I had two brothers, they're a little older than I, or significantly older than I am, and and she'd always say, boys, you need to lower your voices. People are going to hear what you're saying. And, of course, we're going, I think you're stupid. Well, I can't, and you go on back and forth. And you're on smack and saying you're ugly and your mama dresses you funny, things like that. So she was constantly telling us to be quiet because people would hear what we were saying, and it would embarrass the family and so on. So I remember this one time, and I was probably about third grade, something like that, maybe fourth grade. My brothers, who are older than I, were sitting in the thing, and she'd just given it this speech. This was a little nicer place, and we were going out, believe it or not, Mother's Day. And so it was a pretty nice spread, and she said, whatever you do, don't embarrass me in here. Well, for once in my life, I didn't, because the guy next to us in the booth did. So we sit down, and this guy, and I'm not going to go into all that he said, but this guy is there with his wife and his two children, and the kids are perfectly doing what they're supposed to. I mean, typical for kids. I mean, they weren't killing each other. And they're sitting there, and he's annoyed by the kids because they are playing football across the table, but they really weren't being annoying at all. And this guy, and he's talking very loudly, so you can hear Mama's cardinal rule, you don't break that. And he said stuff like this. Won't you do something with them? We're in the South, so that's the reason. Won't you do something with them? Say, honey, they're fine. They're quiet. They're not hurting anybody. Have you lost your mind, woman? And my mom perked up like that. And then he said, you know what? You're just like your stinking mother. You know, woman, you just need to start listening to me. And this life would go a lot better for us. Well, with that, my mom looked something like the lady up here on the screen, and she looks at all of us and says, did he really say what I thought he said? And I actually thought my mama, my little quiet mama, was going to get up and go talk to this guy. And she looks at my dad and she says, Fred, I think you need to go talk to that gentleman. Well, my dad was just waiting on it anyway. He's ready to take him out behind a woodshed. And so he went over, he says, hey, listen, could I talk to you for a second? And I can remember seeing my dad mouth these words. You have insulted my wife on Mother's Day. You need to be quiet before you die. It was the best Mother's Day ever. And my mama was really happy. You understand, my dad was a pastor at the local church, so that's the reason I was a little surprised. That was good. Well, if you'll look at 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians chapter 9, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, the first 5 verses, which we're not going to read right now, but I'm going to summarize for you. You sort of get, when I read this passage again in preparation, my mind went back to that incident with Mama on Mother's Day. And I started thinking about this the other day. I'd read through the passage early in the week, and I'm sitting in a restaurant, and the same thing happened to me. Some guy saying stupid stuff to his wife, and I'm going, have you lost your mind? Are you really saying what I think you're saying? Well, I sort of feel like that when I read this first part of 2 Corinthians chapter 9, because if I may summarize, he says in the first 5 verses, now just listen, Paul is saying this to the Corinthian people as he writes to them. Now, I need to talk to you about something, but I don't really need to talk about it. I don't need to say anything about this. And he said, I have boasted to other people about you, about your giving. And he says in verse 3 but I'm a little concerned, so I'm going to send somebody to check up on you about this whole giving thing. And then in verse 4, and again, depending on which version you read, some of them use different words here, but if I may summarize, I'd be really ashamed, or, you might really be embarrassed if you don't follow through with this gift that you need to be given. But then he says, and can you imagine sitting in the booth beside someone here, but there's no pressure. No pressure at all. I'm not commanding you to do this, but there's no pressure at all. And I got to tell you, as I was reading the passage, I thought, that was pretty bold of him to say those things. Well, I want us to look together at this whole issue, the responsibility principle in relationship to not only our money, but our time, talent, energy, and so on. But specifically this morning, we're going to get very practical about this issue of giving. And Randy has said on more than one occasion, a lot of guys don't like to talk about this. I wonder what would happen if guys got up with the tone I used, that the apostle, using that passage from the first 5 verses, and says, now listen, I don't need to be teaching you guys about this, but you need to get it together. That's not quite how I'm coming this morning, but I want you to look a little deeper with me. We're going to look back in the 8th chapter to just quickly get a glimpse of perhaps what the Apostle Paul was having to say. One of the things I want you to see is this, that the Apostle Paul recognized that there was a real danger in the Corinthians' life, that they were going to be off focus in this thing having to do with money. Focus is incredibly important, very, very, very important when you think about focus. And the reason focus is important is because the reason I do something is more important than even the thing that I do often. Because I can do things, but do them for the wrong reasons, and you know that. Well, I want to take you just back for a little bit to the Corinthians at this particular time. Because in their culture, there was a very interesting approach to how they did things. They had people who were incredibly rich. It is estimated about 5% of the people in the city of Corinth were incredibly wealthy people. There's another estimation that about another 7% of them sort of worked for the very wealthy people, and I'll tell you about those folks in a second. But the one was called patrons. The folks that were very rich were called patrons, and the others were called clients. And the way that a lot of this happened is they actually paid things under the table. So if I'm a rich guy and Ken Garber's working for me, I'd go, hey, and I'd slide it under the table. And there's not going to be tax involved here, and you tell everybody how great I am, and it's back and forth. Well, but with becoming a client, like Ken would be in that, there was a little prestige because you were connected with me. And I'd brag about you, and you'd brag about me, and a little money would go under the table. But it was this incredible system of people taking advantage of each other. You get it? We use another word today in our culture. It's called consumerism. I think if I lay the money down, or if I'm going to work, I'm going to get something, I better get a good bang for my dollar, right? Now, I understand there's a point in terms of a person's worthy of their hire and so on, so I'm not talking about that. What I'd like to suggest to you is that at this particular time in the city of Corinth, there was incredible greed. There was about another 15 to 18% of the people that were sort of individual artisans, so they had their own business. Or maybe they were carpenters or something like that, and they could barely make a living on what they were doing, but at least they were not technically in poverty. They might be just above the poverty line. But then about 70% of the people in Corinth were actually living at poverty line or below. So when Paul talks about this, because this is the context of the passage in chapter 8, when he talks about this whole issue of bringing them up, them bringing an offering to help those who were poor in another city, he, excuse me, you need to understand that this whole issue was not just that, hey, it'd be nice if you gave an offering, but literally there are people in this city that would have been starving to death. And Paul calls on these people to be incredibly generous in their giving. But you see, these people, these patrons, these clients, they gave from an endless vacuum, and the vacuum was their own wants and desires. They gave from a limited ability. In other words, they could only take out of what they had themselves, what they could finagle out of other people. They were always giving with an ulterior motive. If I give you something, you better make sure you give me back. And finally, they gave with their own self in mind. And I'm going to suggest to you that the Apostle Paul says, there is yet another way for you to operate. Rather than operating in consumerism as the body of Christ, whether to operate like they would have called it, a patron and a client, and all these underhanded deals and favoritism. And oh, by the way, when you're doing that, who you know means everything. And this whole place of power and position becomes the motivator for every single thing that you're doing. Just like everything else in the world that Jesus did, even when it came to money, he went completely countercultural. And we're going to look at that countercultural way of doing life by looking at a group of people that he talks about here in the 8th chapter of 2 Corinthians, just in the beginning. Read with me beginning in verse 1. He says, and now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the middle or the midst of their very severe trial, their overflowing joy in extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing this service to the Lord's people, and they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then, by the will of God, also to us. One of the second things, the biggest things that I want you to recognize is God was calling the Corinthian people to become investors and to not be motivated by greed, but instead by generosity. It was as if he was saying, the whole idea that you're going to give something or spend on something and get something back out of it is not to be the focus of your life. As a matter of fact, he says generosity and giving, the focus is on the process of what happens when you give, not the end result of the thing. And the result in the Macedonians' life were these things. First of all, he says they gave from an endless source. God actually gave them the grace, the ability to give in the way that they gave. He says in verse 3 that they gave beyond their own ability. These people were broke. There's every indication that many of them were living on a poverty level. They gave with absolutely no expectations, because he says they came and were begging just to share out of the money that they had. And then he says this, the key to this whole issue is they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then the Lord began to stir up something in them that caused them to give extravagantly when they did not have anything to give. So when you think about this whole issue of giving and how you approach it in life, how you use your finances, and nobody wants to talk about it, but you're going to see it becomes a very uncomfortable set of things to think about. And we get uncomfortable feelings when you start thinking about it. And as a matter of fact, often I have found myself much like what was happening in the Corinthian culture, that when I give, I find myself comparing what everyone else is giving. Now, the truth is, I don't even know what you're giving. But in my mind, I'm amazing. Whether or not I know what you're giving or not. So I want you to just dismiss or I want you to recognize that when we start talking about money in relationship to giving it very quickly can move into either one, I've got to keep up or maintain an image. Or secondly, I want to figure out some way that I can keep what I need for myself, because, you do need to be sensible about this. You need to make sure that you get provision for yourself. We have a group of people in the Macedonians, and we're going to unpack this a little more, that found themselves at a place where they did not have anything to give, and you'll find out that they actually gave in an extravagant way to meet the need, and the whole thing was motivated because they gave themselves first to the Lord. Now, before I start talking any more about money, I want you to recognize this. There's no excuse. There's a lot of us that look like the woman's going to appear on the screen. Anytime the word giving or money or give time, energy, effort comes up, a lot of people are scared to death to come out from behind the seat because they're afraid that if they pop up, somebody will call on them. You know, don't meet eye to eye with me right now because I might actually come up and ask you to take something out of your wallet. You know, we're afraid of that, and there's lots of things we're afraid of. I don't know about you, but when I think about giving, even to this day, I start thinking in my mind the things that I'm not going to be able to do and what's going to happen, and I got a whole list of things that don't matter right now, but the point is that there's fears that rise up in us about how's this thing going to sort out, and I'm going to be very practical about the giving thing. But the reason I want to tell you there are no excuses about giving is because of this. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 8, he makes something very clear. All the pressure's off is about giving. You worried about if you're going to be able to send your children to college? Don't worry about that. You worried about whether or not you're going to be able to have a car or to do whatever's on your list of things to do? He says, don't worry about that. I've got that, and here's why. He says that God is the one that actually gives me the grace or the ability in those things which I should give. I'm going to repeat that very simply. God is the one that's actually going to give me the grace to give and the ability to give. That means if you're sitting here, I don't want you to raise your hand. If you're sitting here this morning and as you're evaluating this whole thing about giving, you're going, yeah, I wasn't sure about this series to begin with, and now he's going to start telling me to put stuff in the plate or to put more in the plate. The good news is, I want, towards the end of this, for you to simply admit to the Lord, hey, listen, Lord, I don't have any desire to give right now, or I'm too afraid to give. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I want you to recognize that God is the one that does it. And he says the reason he does it is because of this. In all things, all the time, all you need is given to you, and you'll overflow in a good work. Now, let me ask you something. How many of you in the course of doing life have found yourself sometime wishing you could do something more, and you don't have to raise your hand, but like me have found that you've overextended your something more category? You know, you recognize somebody has a need and you just don't have the ability to meet it. And I'm not just talking about what we do at the church. Excuse me, in the ministries here. I'm talking in terms of that I find myself that I've extended myself so far that if somebody came up that had a genuine need, I wouldn't be in a place I could do that. But he says this, in all things, at all times, you'll get everything you need. Not just money, all you need to actually invest in the lives of people and to overflow in good work. So the good news is, if you haven't got anything to give this morning, don't worry about it. God's going to give it to you. But you're going to have to decide whether or not you're going to give it to him in the work of ministry. I'd like to suggest to you then that as the Apostle Paul goes on, he says this, I want you to do the math about this issue of giving. I want you to do the math about this issue of giving. And in verse 2, I would remind you, and we read it earlier, so I'm not going to read it again. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 2, the first part of the math is this, talking about the Macedonians. He says you take severe trial, and you write that down, and then plus overflowing joy, which, by the way, is deposited in you by God. It is not driven by the circumstance that's around you. Because these guys had nothing in their circumstances that produced overflowing joy. I'm just wondering, I'm not asking if you are now, but have any of you in the past been really, really close and wondering where your next few weeks was going to come from? Anybody? I've been there before. It's not a great feeling. Excuse me. And maybe you've not been quite that bad, but you're thinking, you know, if things don't get better here in this next year, I'm going to be in a really, really bad place. It's a little hard to have overflowing joy in that. In other words, you can't draw it from the outward circumstance, but it can be deposited there because of my interaction with him. So he says they have severe trial. They added overflowing joy. And then, oh, by the way, extreme poverty. Well, you know, we run pretty tight ship around here in the way we spend money and the way we get money in, right? Everybody know that? You read the back of the bulletin. Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure you're alive. I have a new technique for making sure the church budget is made up. First of all, we're going to put you in severe trial. You're going to be so destroyed or so pressed by that, you're going to go to Christ. He's going to produce overflowing joy in you. And oh, by the way, we're going to add extreme poverty to that. Isn't that great? And the end result is going to be this, that you're going to be able to be richly generous. Some of you are saying, well, hey, man, I must be ready because I got all that going on right now. But I want you to see that those external circumstances do not prevent me from being richly generous. So that's the first part of the math. The next part of the math is from 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 10, and I want to read that with you. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, and then in verse 10. He says this. Actually, I'm going to just go ahead and read the next few verses. He says, now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way, so that you can be generous in every occasion, and through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Now he goes on to say, this service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord people, but also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Now listen really careful to this next part. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, others will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ, for your generosity in sharing with them and with everyone else. And in their prayers for you, their hearts will go out to you because of the surpassing grace God has given to you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. So the second part of the math, we did the first part. The second part of the math is this. God is going to give you bread. Now we're going to flesh this out in just a little bit towards the end, and I'll ask you to pull something out of the newsletter or the bulletin, whichever you care to call it. But he says, first of all, there's bread. Now, we're going to have a little test this morning, see how incredibly brilliant the crowd is. What do you do with bread? Thank you so much. Amazing class, amazing class. Yeah, you eat bread, right? Well, the idea of bread in Scripture has many concepts, but one of them is it's everything I need to exist. And the Scriptures, Paul, as he's talking, he's starting to input to these guys about how they should give. And so he says, first of all, I want you to determine what your bread is and to eat it. And then he says, and God is actually going to give you what you need to have your basic needs be met. And then he says, I'm going to give you seed. Okay, new test. What do you do with seeds? Brilliant crowd. Okay, what do you do with bread? What do you do with seeds? Thought somebody said eat. No, you plant it. No, you do. You plant seeds. Now, he says the result of that, and we'll talk just a little bit later about this, but so I'm saying to you, there's so much that it takes to run your household, right? That's your bread. So I want you to eat that. You can tell your wife, see, Tim said I could spend money. No, really, I want you to eat your bread, but then everything else over the bread is seed to be given for ministry. Now, those of you who are saying, well, Tim, when are you going to start talking about tithing? I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but just hang on to your horses here. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with tithing. I'm not asking you to reject the teaching of tithing. What I'm asking you to do is to look in the Scriptures with me to determine what the passage says. So he says this then, so that you eat your bread, you determine what it is, and you eat that. And then you do your supply of seed. Now, a couple things I want to tell you when you're doing your bread. Nobody else gets to decide what your bread is. If Larry decides I have to have, one of my needs is a brand new boat, while I might have an issue with him that it's something he's got to have, guess what? If he's a good friend of mine, I might challenge him about it, but at the end of the day, the Scriptures teach this, that every man should decide in their own heart what to give. Now, I'm not trying to be nice, so if you have nice stuff, you can say, wow, I'm glad Tim didn't ask me to sell, and you fill in the blank. That's not my point. My point is you got to decide. I'm not in charge of that. But he says you should ask the Lord and decide in your own heart. So whatever the bread is you eat, whatever the seed is you consume. And then he goes on to say in verses 10 through 14, there's going to be some results of that. In other words, as we're doing your math, God gives you the bread, he gives you the seed, you eat the bread, you plant the seeds. Then he said there's going to be some harvest come along. Makes it very clear he continues to give you bread. So the good news is, whatever you do as you're planting the seed, God's going to continue to give the bread. And he says if you plant this seed, he'll not only continue to give bread, but he'll give you more seed. As a matter of fact, he even talks about being a storehouse of seed. That's a lot more seed. And as he gives you that store of seed, the first thing he says that happens is that it expands or gives you a harvest of righteousness. Now, I wonder why planting the seed, the money, and certainly you can say time, talent, and so on, but we're talking about funds right now. I wonder why that gives me a harvest of righteousness. I'm going to tell you why, so listen carefully. Have you ever had you guys that are married, if you haven't had a discussion yet about giving away your precious money and you're never going to see it again, you're going to find out real quickly what a harvest of righteousness is. Because when your mate looks at you and says, you're going to do what? And you're feeling like they're thinking you're stupid. Or if you say, well, listen, I heard what Tim said, and I really do think we need to think about doing this. And all of a sudden, you're in this war with each other about what you're going to do about money. I'm telling you, you're going to need Jesus. And you're going to need a lot of righteousness coming to you. Because that's a hard conversation to have, right? Well, how about this? How about if you're a person, and I'm not asking you to raise hands, but what if you're a person that has a very, very strong concern for the future and what's going to happen and retirement and wondering what's going to happen in the U.S.? This week alone, 3 times last night at dance, I've had 10 people talk to me. Tim, I don't think, it doesn't matter how much money you have. I don't think I'm ever going to have a retirement. What in the world are we going to do? The world's going, that discussion. Anybody had that discussion? Anybody recently? I mean, last night I couldn't even dance last night because everybody wants to talk about how the world's falling apart. I came to have a little fun. But I want you to see this, that when I have fear and I can't see past, in other words, I can't do the math that makes it all turn out just right if certain things happen. If Social Security falls apart, if the market drops, if all those things happen, there's nothing in that gives me any warm fuzzies. But there's one that can give me a place of peace, and his name is Jesus. And as a result, I don't find myself starting to hoard money about things that I can't even do anything about to begin with. You see, God says that it will create a harvest of righteousness in you when you have to grapple with those issues. But also he says the next thing that will happen as God gives you seed is you'll be able to be generous. And then he says in verse 12 and 13 that people will say thank you to God for you. And then he makes a very interesting statement. He says people will not only look at you and say thank you for you, but he says they will also look at you and they will see that your walk and your talk match each other. Now, I'm going to say something. I'm not running for political office. I'm not trying to do anything. I don't want to have a political discussion with anybody afterwards. But how many of you have been in the discussion with individuals that say, well, I can't believe they have so many people, on assistance and this and that. And anybody ever heard a discussion like that? And depends on which side of the issue you fall on. Everybody, the blood veins start popping out on the neck and they get red and they're angry with each other. Well, the same thing was going on in the Corinthian church. And I'm not really caring what you think about that particular thing. What I want you to recognize is this. Often I see believers say, well, we can just let the government take care of things. Even people that don't like that happening that way. Just let the government take care of things. I'm just going to hang on to my money. You know how that goes. This place going to hell in a handbasket. Literally is what people say, right? But the point is that as the world watches us spend money, buy money, not buy things that we could buy, in other words, choose not to spend all the money that we have, and as the world sees us put our money where our mouth is, or more specifically where our heart is, he says that as people watch what you do in terms of your generosity in meeting the needs that are around you, and I'm not just talking about what you give to the church, he says they go, there must be a God. I told the group that I was teaching with last week that I went to drive by, sit in, and I deleted it, but I even took my picture in a 1998 Boxer convertible with 23,000 miles. It's at Blaze Automotive. And I stirred up about this thing. I made plans, and I finally figured out a way to buy it. Except it required something that Karen and I have agreed to a long time ago. And I'm not feeling really great about this. We have a line item in our budget. It's not huge, but it's there to say, if a need happens around me that I need to meet, that I can pull my money out and meet it. Well, I can buy the Boxer, but that line item in my budget has to go. Now, just what do you think the world... I don't care what cars you own. You can buy Beamers and Ferraris and all that. My point is this. Paul says, as people watch what you do with your money, it speaks strongly about this, that you are saying that you are a follower of Christ Jesus, that you believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he's saying this point of being generous, even not knowing whether or not there's going to be a payoff in what you're being generous about, is the heart I want you to have in giving. So you might ask me this, how then, what, Tim, do you want me to do? And we're going to wind down here, so I want you to listen very carefully. As a matter of fact, those of you who have a newsletter with you in the front, in that newsletter, there's a thing that says, what do you want me to do now? Some of this will fit you and some of it won't. If you'd like to take notes on that, that's fine. I'm not worried so much about you taking notes. Now we're going to talk about exactly what giving looks like in the church today and in the lives of our people in our community today. First of all, there are many of you that need to admit where you are. I don't want you running scared, but I do want you to make a list of the concerns you have. As a matter of fact, it might do well for you to just write them on a piece of paper, and I don't want them. Go find the Lord, get on your knees, and hold them up to him there so he can get a really good look at them. And invite him to deal with your fears. Invite the Lord to deal with your bad focus, because here's the thing. You may find yourself in the same place that the Corinthians were. Do you remember where they were? They were in this system where I put it in, I get it out. And the only time they would give in effort, energy, money, or anything like that is when they could get something back out of it. Some people even come into the church today, the body of Christ as a whole, and they are more consumers than they are participants in the life that Christ offers. And so if I happen to do well this morning, we could take another offering. You go, yeah, man, give that boy a tip. But they sort of view church as kind of a tip. And if it's going really well, then great. If not, then, well, maybe we'll just put a couple of bucks back. He says this. A bad focus will ruin the incredible gift that God gives you in this whole issue of giving. Next thing that happens is some of you need to calculate your bread and then eat it. And you say, well, you already said that, Tim. Well, think about it like this. Do not raise your hands. Chris gave me some great statistics about what things are like in America today in terms of finances. Depending on what site you study, anywhere of the average of a little over $10,000 most people carry on their credit cards, as much as $40,000 to $50,000. The truth is it's no mystery that there's a huge industry just rising up around helping people get out of debt because they've overextended themselves. There are many of you that need to make a budget. And so, yes, you came to church this morning, and while I'm talking about giving, I'm telling you, you're toast when it comes to giving because you aren't even paying all your bills. And I'm right about this, right? Not about you specifically, but I'm right about this. In our culture, we're not paying our bills. And so the first thing I want to challenge you to do is to make a budget. And if you don't know how to make one, for the Lord in heaven's sake, ask somebody for some help. Ask for some help. You get to decide in your own heart what you're going to give. You may be upside down, but then I want you to stick to your budget and consume your bread. Secondly, I'd like for you to plant your seed. Remember, you have to do this willingly. You give what is not bread, and you give an increase if you get it. You don't buy everything that you can, and you start even though your seed might be very small, because God is wanting to provide. So here's the principle. You take in money because you work. you eat the bread, you take the seed, you plant it. If it's in the offering plate here, if it's you're helping other individuals as God may lead you, but the point is you plant the seed. And here's what he says. I'm going to take the seed you plant, I'm going to give you more bread and more seed. Now I'm going to tell you a quick story. We had a fellow in Indiana that came to me and he says, I don't know what to do about giving. And I said, well, what you mean? He says, I'm $5 a month under on my budget. Now, what's that mean? He says, it means I get $5 a month less than what it actually takes to pay my bills. And again, remember, I don't care if you think you need to pay for your kids to go to college, fine. If you don't think you need to pay, that's fine. You get to decide your own bread. But this fellow said, I'm $5 a month short on my budget. He says, what am I going to do? How am I supposed to give on that? And I said, this is simple. I'm going to ask you to do just like the Macedonians, who in their poverty gave generously. He says, well, what does that look like? Well, it looks like, excuse me, that you would have a willingness to sacrificially give. And I'm going to unpack that for you right now. And I want you to look with me at what it would mean to sacrificially give when we talk about people that might be poor. But before we talk about people that are poor, let's talk about people if you're not poor. And all not poor means is you're not living on poverty level. And for the sake of our discussion, right now, you're actually able to pay all your bills. If you're already tithing, I want you to do the math. Here's my concern about people that have a lot of money. For some of them to give a tithe is no big deal. I'm going to repeat. For some people to give a tithe is no big deal. Because you're supposed to determine your bread and everything else is seed. I don't want to be in charge of your bread. I just want all the seed to go into the work of the kingdom. Are you following me? Well, so what if your tithe is $20,000 a year? Because you do the math. Your tithe is $20,000 a year. Well, if your seed left over is $50,000 a year, if it's seed, what you're supposed to do with it? Plant it. I'm suggesting to you that a tithe at best is a beginning, a healthy beginning. But Jesus said this, unless you exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees, you're not fit for the kingdom. Guess how much they gave? 30%. We're not asking for that today. But if you're already tithing, I want you to do the math. And if indeed your bread is this piece and it ought to be more, what you're giving ought to be more, then I want you to obey the Lord. If you're eating some of your seed, then plant it. If you struggle that you'll have enough money, so you're keeping money out of fear, if you're struggling because you think you're not getting a good return on your dollar in terms of what you're giving, then set yourself in a situation where you can support those settings that you do see of value, but recognize this: God is not interested in the end result in the sense of your giving. The giving is what he's doing in you. Ask God to change your heart. If you're poor, I want you to give out of your poverty. Let's go back to this idea of giving a sacrificial gift. So my friend says to me, well, Tim, I'm out $5 a month. What do you want me to do? And I said, this is what I want you to do. How many times a week do you eat out? He says, I have to eat out every day. I work construction and so on. And I said, how much do you spend? He says, $6. I said, I got a great plan. Why don't you not eat out twice a week? The first $5 can make up the rest of your budget. And then the other that you get above that, you can make a sacrificial gift of $6. Well, he says, but that's not seed, that's bread. I said, that's exactly right. I'm asking you to make seed out of some of your bread. Now, wouldn't that be a sacrificial gift? Now, before some of you say, well, yeah, but it's not a tithe and they ought to write out. True or false? There are people that struggle really hard with giving, right? They do. And here's one of the things I think we do with people. I am all for the tithe and beyond. But I think people see the tithe and they see that they're upside down on the bills and they're saying, there's no way I could ever give anything. I'm telling you, God would do amazing things if the men in this crowd who are in charge of their families would stand up saying, I'm going to make a sacrifice in the things that I'm doing to sacrificially lay down an offering. And I'm not just talking about giving it to Tri-State. So watch this. I'm calling you out. I double dog dare the men in this place to start making a sacrifice that would look like that. And tell your family about the reason that you're doing those kinds of things. That's a sacrificial gift. But here's the thing, my friend. He says, well, I'm going to do that. And so he did that. And lo and behold, the next year, he got a $5,000 raise. His bread didn't change that much. You know what he said to me? Well, Tim, what do you want me to do? I said, what did you say you were going to do? He said, I'd give the seed. So he gave a little less than the $5,000 because that's what it amounted to. He says, he says, I've had a cost of living increase. Well, give yourself a cost of living increase. So the next year, as we fast forward, he got a $32,000 raise because he got a different job. And he comes to me and he's white as a sheet. I said, what's wrong with you? He says, you're sick? He says, no. He says, I did the math. He says, I ought to be given about $24,000 a year. I said, well, what's the problem? He says, that's a lot of money. But you see, the principle is this. I get the bread. God gets the seed. I wonder if we'd be faithful like my friend and say, Lord, yes, I'll respond to you. If you're young, I want you to start with your allowance right now. If you're a teenager and you're working, you get a little bit of money, guess what? You don't really have bread because somebody else provides that for you. So this is what I want you to do. And people with your family, with your children, I'd like to suggest to you, you have a conversation with them about, okay, what is it your bread is? Well, I need to have a date. Susie really likes to go out to the movies, and I don't even care. But identify an amount of money and say, God, with your strength in me, I will give the seed that's over and above this. And I wish I had time because I could tell you story after story of teenagers who have decided that, God, I'm going to live on this much and I'm going to invest this much. And just watch what the God of this universe says he'll do, because he said, I will continue to give you a greater supply of seed so you can be incredibly more generous. I want you to identify your bread. Remember, you give it to yourself first, and now give your seed and take every bit of increase and give it to the Lord. And finally, this. I want you to watch and respond to the work of Christ. You see, I think we've been making this thing way too complicated. I plead with you. I double dog dare you, if you have no faith in relationship to giving, would you be willing to start and not even at a tithe, and be willing to let the Lord begin to do something in you to stir up faith on top of faith on top of faith, and be faithful to the thing that he'll do. Let's pray. Jesus, we're grateful to you. And we're grateful because of this. We just recognize what you do and how you do it as from you. Would you increase our faith in relationship to giving? In Jesus' name.